Chaps unite.
Chaps unite.
Chaps unite.
Chaps unite.
Chaps unite against racism.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our panel on free speech. I am Nathania Montes, Interim Dean of Student Affairs. I brought this panel together today to discuss the very important topic of free speech and civility. Now more than ever, we are seeing examples of a lack of civility across many mediums, from talk shows to Twitter and other social media forms as well. And it doesn't seem that accountability is the norm. But at COD, we value the importance of discourse, and we encourage students to engage in debate while also taking into account the mission and vision of the college. So I'm hoping our discussion today will allow for more debate and sharing of ideas. I now would like to introduce our panelists. So if each panelist can introduce themselves and their connection to COD.
So I'll go first. Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to be able to be a part of this conversation. And my name is Kalin, and I'm the General Counsel for College of DuPage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. My name is David Goldberg, and I'm a professor of political science, and I've been teaching at the College of DuPage since 2003. So in that capacity, I've worked with a number of student clubs and student organizations, as well as in different faculty capacities as well. So I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steele. I am the manager of student life. We are responsible for new student orientation, the orientation leader program, living leadership program, student clubs and organizations, and the fuel garden and pantry. And in addition to that, I also teach speech communication and leadership development at the college.
Hi everyone, my name is Samiha Syed. I serve as student trustee to the Board of Trustees and as an officer of Student Leadership Council. And it's my pleasure and privilege to be a part of this panel.
Hi everyone, my name is Dorcas, Brou. I am a second-year student here at COD. I'm also a member of Student Leadership Council. I'm a voters rep, and I'm also a film student here at COD.
So thank you everyone for being here. So I'd like to open up by just asking each of you who agreed to be on the panel, why do you believe this topic is an important one?
I think it's really important on the national level because it is, free speech is right there in our First Amendment. And I think that it's fair to describe it as one of the core values of our country. And it's a pretty integral part of how we're to get along in our society as a country. I think on the more local level within student life, we really focus on student development, leadership development, and community development. And I think that, the concept of free speech is also really important in each of those three areas as well. So I imagine we'll kind of unpack that more as we go along, but I think it's a hugely important topic, and I'm really appreciative of this panel.
I'll echo what Chuck has just said. I do think that it's a core value. And I think, the First Amendment is, I would say, a cornerstone to our, American society. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens to be the First Amendment to our Bill of Rights. And with the passage of time, I think that the First Amendment has evolved in our lives and it's touched so many different areas of our lives, whether it's students gathering on public universities and campuses to protest war, whether it's employment issues or labor strife, religious or social movements, all of these things have developed over the course of time. And from a legal perspective and a constitutional law perspective, I would offer this is that I found that the more simple and straightforward the language as found in the Constitution and written by our founding forefathers, the more complex the principle. You would think that the right to free speech and the right to express yourself is just a simple concept, but it's got so much complexity and levels. And I think that this conversation is just so key to start understanding what that means and what's the best way to understand each other in that context.
I think this is a very important question really for two reasons. One, historically in our nation's history, the First Amendment and the protection of speech is obviously central to part of our national identity and our political identity. I think the question of civility and speech has become more relevant in the past 20 years, and certainly more recently than that when we think about our politics, but also our discourse, social media, how people talk about issues, not just contentious issues, but how people talk about issues. So in terms of our nation's history, I think the fact that the First Amendment protects speech, and the intent of that is not the speech that doesn't need protection. The mainstream media and newspapers and media outlets and social media that are less at risk because they're saying things that are less risky. I think the intent of the founders was to protect speech that's edgy, to protect speech that is at times unpopular. And this is something that we talk about in our classes in terms of, on the face of it, the content of the speech may be, in a sense, reprehensible to people. And the court has said in many, many cases that it doesn't matter if the content is something that a lot of people would find distasteful, that if it's still about a public issue, if it's still something that's relevant to the state, then it has protection. I think more recently than that, the issue of civility is important because it's so easy to hide behind social media and the internet and our screens and say things that we might not otherwise say. And so being civil, even when one disagrees with someone else about key ideas, I think is more important than ever, and something that we should all be mindful of on a regular basis, that we really, really have to convey our humanity to one another, even when we're saying things and disagreeing with one another vehemently. There's a way to do that with dignity and to respect one another. And I think that we should all make an effort to do that more and more as a nation and as individuals at work and at home and in all of our relationships.
I think for me personally, freedom of speech is important because that is the reason that we are at this panel today. That is the reason that we are able to have this conversation. And I personally just believe in freedom in general, freedom of religion, expression, and ideas. And I think that is the foundation our country is based on. And we are very lucky to have that in this country, unlike other countries where you could even get arrested for expressing your idea that might go against the government or the law placed there.
I agree with the other panelists. It's not easy to be brave and bear your mind, thoughts, and sentiments in the market of public opinion. And it's even worse to be scrutinized for it. So when it comes to a differing opinion, just like in a marketplace, we don't have to buy anything we don't like or agree with, but people have the right to make a livelihood, and that right should be protected. Similarly, people have a right to having an opinion regardless by virtue of being human, and that right should be protected. In other countries, people are silenced, killed for voicing their opinions. So it is a true privilege and blessing to live in America, to have First Amendment rights, and to be able to discuss whether these rights are truly being upheld in society. Thank you.
Thank you all. And so now that we've sort of established why free speech is so important, I think it might be helpful for us to have a better understanding of what exactly it means. And so the title of our panel, discussion is, does free speech really mean I can say whatever I want? So Lily, can you walk us through a little bit legally what free speech means and what the First Amendment really tells us?
Sure. So, there's a lot of breathing room in the First Amendment, but it's not a free-for-all. And so I think the First Amendment, it affords you to have the protections to speech and expressive conduct, but it's not absolute. And so the Supreme Court, through its prodigy of cases, has come down and said, the government can regulate speech in terms of time, place, and manner in certain circumstances as long as it's conformed to the Constitution. So I think the easiest way to have this conversation is to look at three silos of what is free speech, what's absolutely not protected under the First Amendment, what's limited protection, and then what is regulated under the Constitution and what's been developed through case law. So first I'd start with what's not protected. And that is a limited scope, but it's a defined one. So obscenity, child pornography, fighting words, or true threats, those are types of categories of speech that are not protected by First Amendment. So when it comes to fighting words and true threats, this is where it's the form of intimidation at an individual or groups where it's caused to have them evoke some violent reaction, or it's for them to believe that there's a imminent threat of an unlawful violence at them. So there's a seminal case in this instance, Brandenburg versus Ohio. It's a longstanding case where the Supreme Court held that the government can't punish inflammatory speech. So offensive speech is protected speech. But the caveat in that opinion came down to say, unless that speech is used to intentionally and effectively provoke a crowd to immediately carry out violent and unlawful action, it's not protected. But the way the court has set this standard, it's extremely high. So when we move away from what's not protected, we have limited protected speech. And this is, again, more defined. And in this instance, what's harmful to children, defamatory speech like libel and slander statements, commercial speech, and public employee speech. And I'll just briefly touch upon public employee speech since we're a public institution. I think at times there is the perception that I can say whatever I want to say, and it's protected under the First Amendment. But again, from constitutional law, there's a seminal case of Pickering versus Board of Education. And in that instance, the Supreme Court looked at, does a public employer have a little bit more of a right to restrain their employees from coming out and making statements that they would perceive to be under the First Amendment? And in that case, the court said an employer has more of an interest of regulating the speech of its employees rather so than a private citizen. And there's always an exception, with the exception if that employee is speaking out as a concerned citizen. Then in that right, your speech is protected. So once you get out of those two categories of what can I say, everything else is protected speech. But I would say what comes into this discussion is what can be regulated. And so when the speech and the content is neutral, then we have the case law that says, well, can COD or can any public university come in as a government and say, how can we regulate this? And they can, in based of time, place, and manner. And so I mentioned, offensive speech, that it is protected speech, but the caveat to regulations is if that offensive speech, if you have a captive audience, and by captive, I don't mean that they're engaged, but that they're trapped, and they feel that they can't walk away. Now you've shifted into the time and place of manner, how you're presenting that speech, where privacy rights come into issue and to view. And so now that protected speech is no longer protected. So I think those are the best ways that I can explain from a legal perspective what's protected, not protected, and how far we can move with the regulation of the content neutrality of the speech.
So let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So then how does that then extend to the use of social media, for example, in terms of that idea of what is a captive audience or someone being trapped in some ways? So how does free speech then extend to social media?
So it's interesting because that's being developed now. So certainly social media is a little bit of an interesting phenomenon because typically, depending on what social platform you're on, you can limit your audience and you assume that the audience you are speaking to, they your friends, have you invited them? So is this conversation now being engaged? Or do you recognize that, like on Facebook, some of the statements that are being made have a more broad audience. And so now you're really reaching out farther. So there is a distinction between, I think, what is protected under the First Amendment legally versus social circumstances and consequences. And for instance, I'll give examples, we've seen them. What could be protected under the law of First Amendment might not necessarily be what your employer or prospective employer would view as something that is offered the same protections. An example is Don Imus. So Don Imus had disparaging and disrespectful statements to say about the Rutgers female basketball team. And although you could argue that his statements were protected under First Amendment, his employer viewed them to be not what they wanted their institution to have as an employee, and he was terminated. So there are certainly consequences that social media and making those types of statements in that public forum can raise that are outside the bounds of First Amendment.
Okay. So Chuck, your area in student life, you see many different student clubs and organizations and outside organizations that have varying beliefs. How does student life sort of balance that in terms of clubs, organizations, outside community members who want to engage in COD and also to be able to express their beliefs and their values to the college?
In student life, we really focus on the student clubs and organizations in this regard. For the community people who would want to participate on campus, that falls under our distribution of printed material policy, and we administer that in student life, but I wouldn't necessarily call that part of our programming. So within that, you know, there's a legal responsibility that we follow in terms of allowing for that. I think the benefits of having community members come on campus and share their views is a positive thing. And so I think that, you know, in general, it works really well. In terms of the clashes that sometimes happen, you know, the time that we spend, this is where student development and leadership development and community development do come into play. Because part of what we're trying to do, you know, I think one of the purposes of education is to really educate students how to interact in society, right? And there are going to be multiple views in society. And so, you know, one of the questions, you know, I think you had kind of mentioned it earlier, all the bad examples we have in terms of media, you know. My advice always is, you know, if you know, don't watch those shows. You know, turn off the television. If you want to learn how to communicate and resolve differences and manage conflict, those are not the examples to turn to. We always, you know, or a series of questions that we ask, whether it's in class or in workshops, is, you know, it's about our culture, and it's, you know, what do you take from the culture, what do you contribute to the culture, and what do you reject from the culture? And so I think, you know, what we try to instill in the students that we work with is this idea of, I guess it does come down to leadership. You know, our definition of leadership, we have 3 tenets. We have active participation, we have an appreciation of multiple perspectives, and we have conscious decision making. And each of those things, I think, really ties into this, because in terms of active participation, what we mean by that is, if you're going to be part of a group, you're going to be an active member of that group. So whether that group is your family, your place of work, your group of friends, you're going to be an active member. And what that means is, you know, you're going to have to share your ideas. You're not necessarily always going to be in sync with everybody else who is in that particular group. But as an active member, you have to interact. Appreciation and understanding of multiple perspectives really is the importance of, you know, quite frankly, we're better together. You know, we are better holding some different views. That's how we learn, quite frankly. So learning how to listen and to open your mind and to consider other perspectives is hugely important. And then the last piece about conscious decision making is, you know, the question isn't always, can I do this? You know, it's not always about what you can do, it's about how you do it. So when we talk about conscious decision making, one, it's about making sure that you're living your values. It's about making sure you appreciate your own sense of empowerment. And it's about making sure that you have a goal in these situations. And so, you know, the thing that I think kind of underlines it all too is, you know, whenever you're working with groups, it's going to take time. It's just going to take time. And I think as a society, we have this, you know, obsession with efficiency, and obsession with moving quickly, and an obsession with, you know, getting things off of our task list. And I think that works against effective communication. And so I think, you know, when you talk about what we're trying to do with the student leaders that we operate with is these are the lessons that we're trying to teach that, you know, go hand in hand with that whole concept of free speech. Because again, you know, as we learned from Jurassic Park, it's not what you can do, it's should you do it. So that's always the question is, you know, just making sure everything is in alignment and taking your time.
You know, Chuck, I think you hit on, in my, what I heard is you really giving a good definition of what civility is. And so you touched upon some key things when I think of civility, of having that deference and respect to other people's feelings and ideas. And it's taking that civility and being able to have that difficult conversation or that troubled conversation, but doing that with an openness and in genuine respect to just be open to listen to what people have to share, even if you don't agree with it, even if you've never thought of it in that way. But I think some of that deference and civility goes a long way, and it starts with that slow process of working with different groups, but it certainly helps where it moves away maybe some of that discourse if you approach it from that perspective.
And the other piece I think that's important in there too is that you don't have to react right away. You can take your time and consider and percolate on these ideas and perspectives that other people are saying. And then you can circle back after an appropriate amount of reflection and then, you know, continue the engagement. And again, that's where it goes to, it takes time. It doesn't all have to be handled in one conversation. And I just think there's a real benefit to kind of following that process.
So I think that Chuck's comments about practice are a good way to dovetail off of Lily's comments about the more theoretical and constitutional application of these things, to think about it both in the abstract in terms of what the Supreme Court has said is protected or is not protected speech, and then taking that down to a level that shows how it applies at the College of DuPage and what that looks like on campus, and that there are limits, as Lily laid out, and in terms of what Chuck is administering sort of on a regular basis. But all of these rights have boundaries, right? It's not fair to say that there are no limits to freedom of speech. And so when we think about this beyond the silos that Lily was addressing, in the practical sense on campus, it's a public space and people have the right to express their opinions on all manner of issues that are relevant, right? And so that means a variety of groups on campus. But it also means that they can't be disruptive, right? That they can't be disruptive to the process of teaching and learning. It means that they have to be, in a sense, notified at the school of who they are, what the organization is, what they plan to do, right? So it is bounded in the sense that they're going to be showing up at school and letting student life and letting the police or other authority that's necessary, let them know what it is they're going to be doing. And that might mean tabling on campus, it might be distribution of materials, but it doesn't mean you can walk through the halls of campus and just give people literature, no matter how important or well-intended the individuals are. And I think that's something important that we've had to deal with on and off over the years, where people view the campus and students as a potential sales, right? That they're trying to sell something, so be that political or spiritual or an actual market. That's a problem, because I think as much as everyone has a right to express their opinions, that doesn't mean that everybody gets to run roughshod through a public place and take advantage of the fact that we're an open campus and an open institution. So I think that's a nice application of how there are practical limits on a daily basis to what freedom of speech looks like.
So Samiha and Dorcas, you know, as we sort of talk about, both of you are student leaders and you have been engaged in different dialogue with groups. Can you talk a little bit about how free speech, and even, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about civility in a little bit, but how those have come into play in your experiences at COD?
Of course. So what is freedom of speech? What does it mean to want to say something? And is what we want to say truly our own voice? Freedom of speech means we can say anything we'd like to, regardless of what it is, and freedom of speech is the human right. Everyone has a right to being able to express their perception. As human beings, we must value each other's humanity and human rights. We do not have to support views we do not agree with, but we should support the right of others to hold those views as virtue of being human beings. and to empower people to share and exchange their thoughts and ideas as a fundamental right. And in doing so, improve and better society on matters of public importance, to raise one's voice against societal ills, oppression, and tyranny. That is the spirit of freedom. Rather than inheriting beliefs, thoughts, and ideas, we should strive to be seekers of knowledge, thereby inheriting a legacy of freedom. Our end goal should be to learn how to think, not what to think. Only then will we be able to truly exercise and protect our right to freedom of speech. To know something is to understand. It is not to conform. And understanding doesn't come from simply being taught. It is something that must be sought after. Is what we believe really what we believe, or is it taught? So, fellow students, I leave you with that. Strive to inherit the legacy of freedom and strive to be free thinkers.
Yes, and adding on to what Samiha said, she said a lot of beliefs that I personally hold, and within our own student leadership council team, our group thrives on ideas. We're all different. We've all had different experiences, and in our differences, we've even have similarities, but without those differences, without those different ideas, there's not a lot that we would be able to get done if we were all like-minded. And so I really think freedom of speech is beautiful, that we're able to say what we want, regardless of what that is. And we're able to do that in a civil way, because our group also has trust and a sense of vulnerability. And I think that is also important to have that in a group, so that those in that group feel that they are able to express themselves and share their ideas, regardless of if one person would agree or not. And I will continue to fight for that right.
I agree with Dorcas. Sorry about that. But yeah, multiple perspectives, like in valuing multiple perspectives, only then can we really be at harmony in terms of like as a society or as a team. And only then will we really be able to uphold the right to freedom of speech. So there cannot be freedom of speech without that diversity of thought. So in essence, like learning to value the spirit of freedom while keeping in mind that what it means for people to have different views, and that it's okay to agree with different perspectives and it's okay not to agree. But regardless, these views should be protected and the right to hold those views should be protected. So the real problem is when we engage in cancel culture and invalidate other people's opinions. And healthy debate is at the crux of lively discussion. And it's not only intellectually stimulating, but it also helps one to learn to better think for themselves.
If I can jump in just to add one more idea to that, and that is, I think it's really productive to, I think there's an assumption that conflict is always bad and negative. And I think that, the idea that there is productive conflict, and unproductive conflict, but conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing. And so then it's how do you use conflict productively? And I think that, again, in student life, what we do is experiential education. And part of that is we talk about the different zones. That starts, the base of it is your comfort zone. And that's the zone that most people are familiar with. And the phrase, get out of your comfort zone, you hear all the time, but nobody talks about what is outside that comfort zone. And we, in experiential education, that's the learning zone. That's the growth zone. And then outside of that is the panic zone. And that's when you stop learning and all you want to do is get back to the comfort zone. But the ability, when you think about it, in those terms, the idea that, to really grow and to really learn involves a little discomfort. It involves a little bit of exposing yourself in a way that is, opening your mind, considering new ideas. And if you can, we have to kind of change our paradigm and how we think of these things like comfortableness. We shouldn't, the minute we feel uncomfortable, we shouldn't try to get back to our comfort zone necessarily. We might want to spend a little time getting acclimated, understanding the situation we're in, and that's how we learn and grow. So if we can think of comfort and conflict in more, well, uncomfortableness and conflict in more positive terms, I think that's really helpful as well.
And I can appreciate what you're saying, Chuck. And Samiha, I want to kind of piggyback off of something you said with this idea of cancel culture. So there have been some trends that have been happening that we see a lot of in the media, that someone will say something or post something that another person finds to be offensive. And as a result of finding that statement or that action offensive, then that person will go on, proactively reaching out in an effort to cancel the individual that made the original comment. And so I would like for you all to kind of weigh in on that in terms of how can we respond to speech that we find to be offensive, understanding that what we find offensive based off of what you're saying, Chuck, which is kind of who we are, may be different for someone else, and that there isn't, necessarily one standard of what is offensive and what isn't. And so how do we manage that or navigate that in that free speech arena? Because offensive speech, per what Lily was saying, is protected.
Right. I think maybe that's a starting point where people don't understand that or don't know how far they could make a statement. There's a difference of what I said earlier of what's protected, but you're still accountable. Your words matter, and they should matter. But you shouldn't be canceled. You shouldn't be dismissed, because then it becomes that it's more stagnant if you're just looking for the same people that have the same views and opinions as yourself. I'll say this, I think what's important are platforms like this when we are in higher education, or we're just in education to begin with. And from my perspective to bring to this table, what I reviewed was a lot of case law that says, education is more than just attending a classroom. It's the need for students and faculty in the community to have that personal intercommunication. And if they don't have that, if they don't share that, that's where the court really came in and said, no, offensive speech like this, some of this discourse, as long as it's not rage, violence, you're not threatening individuals, you're not impinging on other people's rights, that's okay. And it should be okay, because without it, the University of Chicago has this big forum on freedom of speech. It's without that kind of conversation where we try to put too many codes, it prevents people from being able to talk. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question, but I thought that kind of, helped with what is legally protected, and then being allowed to just have then, how do you answer when someone disagrees with you? I think it's okay that they disagree.
So I think Lily makes a good point about free speech in an environment of the context of higher education. And my sense as a political scientist is that we have an obligation to create a space where there's room for a diversity of opinion. And that can mean ideological, economic, identity. There's a lot of different ways to sort of think about that opinion. But the point should not be that it's anybody's goal to only present one point of view. I think that flies in the face of what I understand to education to even mean, right? Because how can you sharpen your critical thinking skills if you're only privy to one position, right? Having said that, to bring that back to this notion of cancel culture, it's very subjective, this notion of what's offensive, even though it's in a Supreme Court case about obscenity called Miller versus California, it doesn't define what offensive is. It defines obscenity, but it doesn't really define what offensive is, and doesn't even really define obscenity. So there's some ambiguity even in these court cases. So what's offensive to one person on this panel might be not offensive to someone else. And we can think about the consumption of art and pop culture and music and everything else that's very, very subjective. So to this point about cancel culture, I think that's having a moment, right? And sort of disagreeing with someone versus saying that their opinion doesn't matter are two different things. So if I stridently disagree with your opinion and I think that it's not useful, then I'll unfollow you on Twitter or whatever the platform is, right? That's your right to do that. That's different than, I think in general, people should be open to hearing a diversity of opinions, both because it's going to challenge our conventional wisdom. Maybe I'll rethink my position on this contentious issue. Maybe I'll feel reinforced in my views based on what this other person's saying. So I think that in higher education, this is really, really important to sharpen critical thinking skills. And just to be dismissive because you don't like what someone says is feels superficial and not what we're trying to promote in terms of higher education. But there's also content that's, like I said, worthy of individuals saying, I don't want to follow you anymore. I'm not interested in what you have to say. And that's not necessarily a First Amendment issue as far as I'm concerned. That's just an issue of taste. And I no longer wish to follow you. And that's my right as someone that's on social media. That has nothing to do, frankly, with the First Amendment and the Constitution and the protections of the state about the First Amendment.
Yes, and adding on to Lily, I think that cancel culture, honestly, is sad. And I think with the advancement of social media, we've created this culture where we are now able to hide behind a screen and say whatever we want. And therefore, if somebody says something that we don't like, people can go to the ends of wanting to, ruin their career or calling their schools and contacting things that would just not go well for the rest of their life. And so what I have to say about offensive speech, I think that it is important that society is exposed to wrong ideas in order to strengthen the belief in right ones. I think that offensive speech is inevitable. There will always be people who will offend you. I think that often that is subjective. Like you guys all kind of mentioned, something that could offend me might not offend you. And I think that it's important that we're willing to, first off, put our pride aside and try to understand where that person is coming from. There's a reason that we all believe the things that we do. And if we're not willing to see that, we can't get anywhere. And so kind of like Chuck said, conflict isn't always bad. There is good conflict and it can be productive. And though we might not always agree, I think it's important that we can come to a compromise or even agree to disagree. And that is the beauty of freedom of speech. That's
I
it.
agree with Yeah, I agree with Dorcas. Like, cancel culture is a form of oppression. So when we stop people from saying what they'd like to say, you are taking away their freedom. So when we speak, we are sharing our ideas, we're expressing our beliefs and thoughts. So if our thoughts are canceled or invalidated, do we truly have freedom of speech? And like being people who, what we may stand for principal virtues of humanity and speak of rights and speak of what is like offensive speech, we know that that is wrong. Like I wouldn't go up to someone and say something that's offensive just because like that's just not something you would do. But the right to do that really stems from that place of freedom. So society does look down upon people who deviate from societal norms. And at times, if you were to deviate from a societal norm, conformity, it's not a bad thing. So what is society? We are society, what we hear, what we say, and how we function as a collective in environments of socio-cultural relevance. And deviance from societal norms, again, is looked down upon, but we need to learn to think in terms of individualization and focus on the unique strengths and capabilities of people rather than a one-size-fits-all philosophy. And that will benefit society as a whole. We need to stop conforming and encouraging conformity in all aspects of life. We are taught what to say and what not to say certain things in public, and speech that is disapproved of or excluded based on the environment or the company we have at the time. But to develop strong interpersonal skills, a person must learn about context, being a functional member of society, and what it means to be a team player. There needs to be a balance between distinguishing one's own voice from that of popular opinion. So I feel all of those conversations are relevant to the concept of freedom for us to truly uphold that.
Yes.
Well, go ahead, Dorcas.
Okay, sorry. Adding on to Samiha, I think everything she said was very important because in our society, a lot of the ideas and creations we have, like from film to the telephone, things like that, somebody thought of that. They weren't thinking like it wasn't the norm. They had to think outside of the box and they had to be different. And they were able to express that idea, share that idea so that we have some of the innovations that we have today. And going on to offensive speech or hate speech, I think the only way to combat hate speech is more speech. If we're to shut down everybody, there are still going to be people who have offensive things to say. They're just not going to say it publicly, but they're still going to have those ideas. So if we want to change the way that people think or educate them, we need to be able to have those conversations rather than just shutting them down or telling them that they are wrong or canceling them, because that's not productive. They will still have those ideas. So it's kind of looking at, what is it that we want to get out of this conversation? What do we want to change from this individual, their way of thinking? What is the right way of thinking? And how can we express that in a respectful way?
I think I'm going to deviate a little bit from the norms of the panel. Just to say, I agree with really what everyone has to say. I do get a little nervous about the term cancel culture, in terms of sometimes I feel it's not well defined necessarily, and I think that sometimes it's used as a defense. You know, there's a effort to expand, you know, what it means. So in terms of, I think there is a power dynamic that should kind of be looked at, you know, when we talk about cancel culture, you know, in terms of, I think people with power canceling people with less power, bad thing. I think people with less power canceling people with more power, you know, it's rarer. And I think sometimes it's used, I think sometimes people with power claim cancel culture when they're actually getting critiqued. And they don't, you know, they're getting feedback in a way that they don't normally they're not used to getting feedback. So I think, you know, the essence of it, of, you know, what we're all saying kind of is the importance of speech and the need for more speech and allowing for speech. I'm right up, you know, with you. It's just, there's something about, you know, when things become, when labels become a little trendy, I think sometimes they get a little overused and expanded. So I think I just like to make sure that it's easier for me to look at specific instances and talk about those things rather than a broad label like that.
And I think that's an important distinction, Chuck, because I do think that sometimes if we don't have the same shared vocabulary in terms of, do I mean the same thing that you mean when I use this word, that can lead to more misunderstandings, and also can sometimes escalate situations because people can be arguing and they're having two separate arguments. They're not engaging each other.
Even though they truly agree, but they don't realize they agree because they're using different terminology. So yeah, I think that's hugely important.
I will say this from a legal perspective, I have not found cancel culture yet in any case law, but I'll be on the hunt for that. And it might be something that should be developing, because in a sense, it could be that it's a way to be a restrictive way of people being able to express themselves. But it hasn't gotten there. Because I think so much has now been created on social media, and people feel that they have the right to be able to express themselves in this way, and in effect muffling and silencing people in the same way. But to be continued if this comes up. And if you hear it somewhere else, it came from me that this might show up on the Supreme Court's docket. So we'll see.
Yes, and adding on to Lily, yeah, honestly, cancel culture, it is mainly on social media. I know we don't normally use that term in person, because I think that also in person people aren't as bold with wanting to just tell you you're wrong or wanting to disagree with you in a disrespectful manner. So yes, mainly on social media. Hopefully it doesn't come to in person, but.
And I guess my question would be, and I'll pose this to Lily, in some ways, when people are reacting to what they find to be offensive speech, and they do go the perspective of attacking in many ways the person who made the comment, in sort of an ironic way, they are then making threats or using intimidation or sometimes invoking violence, which is not protected by the First Amendment. So
Correct.
Some ways a reaction to what someone deemed offensive then goes in a different direction, and now they're violating potentially First Amendment.
Right. So what's clear, so the complexity of the First Amendment, I think we all understand and share, I think, that thought and the evolution of it. But What's very clear, what's not protected by the Constitution are any rage, violence, fighting words, true threats. What I mentioned before, that does not give you any coverage under First Amendment. And so certainly there's analysis. Are you directing it on one person? Is it going at Dorcas? And did that cause Dorcas now to have this violent reaction? And so then her reaction would not be protected under the First Amendment, and theirs wouldn't either. So it is interesting that it does create this, this circular argument going back and forth where you're really canceling each other out, not to keep using cancel, but you're negating, right, of what the message is truly about.
Absolutely.
And there's something about, you know, and again, we're talking in very generalities, but that setup is, I would call, a non-productive conflict, right? And so I think that leads to the importance of, we don't have to get sucked into every conflict we see. We have to evaluate the situation. Is somebody saying something offensive to get a rise out of me, to get a reaction? And then, you know, am I going to react differently when I start to think about what the other person's goals are and what are my own personal goals? And, you know, so we have to think, I think, you know, we all have emotions, and we should, you know, recognize our emotions and our immediate reactions, but we shouldn't let our emotions control those decisions. We should still, there should be, you know, your intellect should kick in and should kind of, again, recognize your emotions, but then think it through before you just react. Because once you start spiraling, and I think that's part of the problem, is once you're in an emotional conflict, it is so hard to then draw yourself back out to a point of control. So the more you can avoid it early on and kind of figure out your own thoughts ahead of time, the better off you are.
So I think Chuck makes a really good point about the interpersonal piece of this and the emotional part of it. And I think the way that I think about this in class, and I try to create a climate where we can disagree without being disagreeable. When it sort of collapses to the level of personal attack, then any sort of rational thought process and any critical thinking has been erased. And what's the goal, to Chuck's point about, if someone's trolling you and pushing your buttons emotionally because they know you're sensitive about X, Y, and Z, that's not really a productive conversation about a policy or an idea or a conflict. That's something that's very personal. And so I think it's again, that we all have to, and it takes a lot of work to be mindful of the distinction between, I may disagree with the policy or the idea that you're promoting, but that doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It doesn't mean that I disagree with you as an individual. It means we have a difference of opinion. And I think when we can keep those kinds of conversations elevated to that level, that we share ideas and we share a disagreement, but that in and of itself does not need to become ad hominem attacks on someone's personality or their identity or the group that they represent. It doesn't need to be any of that. And that distinction is hard in this day and age. And again, I think changes in social media in the last generation or so facilitate and really promote and exaggerate that individual ad hominem attack. But I think that doesn't serve us well as individuals. It doesn't serve our politics well. It doesn't serve civil discourse about serious ideas at a time when we need to be having serious conversations about things that are going on in our country and the world. Just to reduce everything to attacks on someone's appearance or who they are, it does no one any good other than the people that are promoting those attacks. But it doesn't serve any purpose. I think keeping that distinction clear in one's mind is difficult and more necessary than ever before.
Which provides a nice transition to a conversation about civility, when we sort of think about the infusion of emotion into dialogue. And so I'm curious for all of you, because even the term civility is a very loaded word, depending on, you know, again, what that definition is. So for each of you, how would you define civility?
For me, civility means to be able to have a conversation without name calling, being disrespectful, none of that. So to be able to have an open discussion and wanting to hear the other person and wanting to understand why is it that they believe what they believe, and just kind of basing things on facts rather than just appealing to our emotions or letting our emotions take over, which often is seen in what we like to call cancel culture on social media. I think a lot of times people choose their emotion rather than the facts, or rather than just thinking for themselves.
So I agree that like civility really is all about just embracing people as people, because that's really what we need in society, to really like understand that people need people, and that every single person has that respect that we should uphold to the maximum possible level that we can. And again, like suppression isn't change. So when we shut someone down, or when we're saying like you can't say that or that shouldn't be said, that is right in its own regard, but rather than just shutting that negativity down, we should overwhelm that negativity, that dividedness, that discord with unity. So yeah.
So I would want to support what Samiha and Dorcas had to say about what civility means. The idea that fundamentally it's about respecting someone else's humanity, and also being open to listen to what it is that they have to say, even if you have a predisposition towards not agreeing with that. And the idea that these sorts of discussions should at least in part be based on evidence and the assertion of points and claims that are supported by facts. And we can disagree sometimes about what facts matter, but at its core, it cannot simply be, again, an assertion of something without any support. I mean, I think that's something that we're all doing in our classes, is working with students to try to develop the ability to make claims supported by evidence, not simply, this is what I think or feel. And that's an important distinction, and something that's hard to learn because people have very strong opinions. But civility means I'm hearing you, right? That intellectually and emotionally, I'm open to hearing what you have to say, and to potentially chewing on it and thinking, maybe this is worth my attention. Maybe this is worth me thinking about my position. Because if you're closed off to that, then it's just a downhill spiral in terms of incivility. And we all live and see where that leads. And that's not productive for school or our national politics or our personal and professional lives. So I think civility is really the watchword. It doesn't limit what you can say, all right? But I think, as was pointed out earlier, it comes with responsibility.
For me, I think civility evokes a sense of calmness and some tolerance and control to the deference of other people's ideas and feelings, without feeling that by giving that deference, you're sacrificing your own perspective, your own morals, your own ideas. I don't think it's a tit for tat, it's a balance. And by affording that deference, and by keeping that open mind and genuine respect, I think gets you beyond where what Chuck was talking about is maybe being able to control that emotion. Because when thinking of freedom of speech, I can think of all of the symbolic things that we haven't talked about that are also covered by freedom of speech, such as burning swastikas, burning crosses. Those images are hard, I would think, to hold your emotional level and temperament neutral. But I think that does help for you to be able to have that conversation if you have that component of civility.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about civility, I think there has to be, again, part of it is I always kind of look at things from a power structure. And if there's sometimes I think civility is used as, an invocation of power, it's to say, this is the behavior I want you to do. So I think, again, semantically, I think, we just have to be on guard for that. But for me personally, I think civility, there's a piece of an agreed upon norms that when we come together as a group in this environment, that we all get to participate in setting what those norms are. Because I think as we go from group to group or location to location, that idea of civility changes a little bit in terms of what is an accepted norm. But I do think, it comes down to a lot of the values that have already been expressed in terms of respect. That's how you get to agreement, is by respecting the other person and respecting, their rights. And so I think there has to be an agreement, because like I said, there's some variation of what I would consider civility as the variables change.
I feel also, you can go ahead, Lily.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Or sorry. I feel also that the media is important to this conversation. So the media engages in logical fallacies, overgeneralizations, stereotypes, hyperboles, and an accurate representation of the truth. And then there's propaganda, websites, speeches, images that disparage racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. And they're all examples of images that are detrimental to society as a whole. And there is real and fake news everywhere. So the media is a mechanism we as the masses consume that in turn tells us the do's and don'ts of society, what is right, what is wrong, what is concerning, and what isn't. So our thoughts and opinions in this regard become just an afterthought, like much like you are what you eat, you are what you read. Your opinions can very well stem from that same place. So, of course, our conceptual frameworks, the happenings of our life, people we've met, environments, experiences, everything we've been exposed to act as significant factors in determining our perception and how we view certain matters. But the power of perception and common thought are closely intertwined. We all function from a similar collective, that of being human, of knowledge, of learning, of literature and education. Some of us may employ the use of slang we've picked up from our peers, words and phrases we've picked up from books or films. Our use of diction is profound in that regard. So it is important to be aware of these mechanisms that may influence us to follow and conform rather than to think and speak for ourselves. All these forces, evident or underlying, must be identified in order to truly exercise and protect one's freedom of speech. And it's very relevant to the concept of civility in terms of how we conduct ourselves and how we think and how we walk into a situation with what frame of mind.
I think that you just made a great argument for the importance of education. And I think so much of what you said, I view as just the ability to be a critical thinker.
Yes.
And I think that, that goes hand in hand with being well educated, because there are dynamics going on all around you. And to kind of circle back to that idea of, if you're not aware of the culture and where that culture comes from, and then also if you're not aware of your own power to have an impact on that culture, right? You're not living up to your capabilities. So again, it goes back to those conscious choices to say, I see this part of the culture and I reject it, and I'm going to replace it with this respect that I'm bringing. And I just think that's, again, hugely important and well said, Samiha.
Yes, and adding on to Chuck and Samiha, I think that was awesome and well said. I think often with social media now, we often see with the media, things are just uploaded and people read it and receive it and just believe it as truth. And I think that critical thinking is not something that is seen a lot in our culture today. And I think that is sad. And I think that is why it's very important for education, that we need to continue to educate ourselves and question the things that we believe and look into sources and who's saying these things, who's uploading these things, rather than not wanting to think for ourselves and just believing everything that we see. And I think social media honestly is harming that.
And I think that speaks to kind of the larger goal in many ways of a lot of what we've talked about today, which is really this idea of inclusiveness being very important, that there has to be room for this diversity of thought and this idea that, it's very easy to be inclusive when everyone thinks the same way that you do, right? But it becomes a lot more challenging to be inclusive when somebody kind of, doesn't think the same way you do. And I think it also speaks to this sense of accountability, which is also, then I have to be accountable to what I say. And in that accountability, there's also the ability to say, I made a mistake, or I said something that I didn't realize that there would be impact in saying, and now that I realize that, I would like to say something different. And is there room then from that inclusive perspective to allow for that, restoration in some ways for that person? And I think that can sometimes be hard. To Chuck's point of, if we're in a hurry all the time to react to things as opposed to taking some time to respond. This has been a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all of your input and ideas. Any final thoughts or closing words from each of you?
The panel on free speech is speechless.
That means we've covered everything.
You know, I just wanted to say I greatly appreciate being part of this panel. I think it's such an important conversation. Usually when you talk about the law, I've either put someone to sleep or people just give the stare look. And I appreciate being able to present that and talk about it in a way where it gives context to where we are, where we were, and where we can move in terms of freedom of speech. Certainly, you know, I've said that I do find the First Amendment to be fascinating. I think it's complex. But beyond just the black letter law, behind the case laws, behind the opinions, there's so much more to it. And it's, I think, what we've touched upon today, when it deals with emotions, civilities, canceling our thoughts, it's about, you know, a voice. It's about respect and the dignity. And I think that that's the balance that comes with all of the black letter law that I shared today. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And what other better way when you're dealing in this environment, in this educational environment, that I think is to create this robust and open environment where we can challenge concepts, we can express our thoughts, and that's, I think, at the heart of free speech and being able to protect that. So I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I appreciate it.
So I think my final thought would be we shouldn't be afraid of ideas. We shouldn't be afraid of any ideas, right? As an intellectual exercise, we should always be willing to engage with an idea and not run in fear, right? Because fear triggers different things going on in our brain. So fear is not really the way to approach this. That doesn't mean that all ideas are created equally, right? And so not, because we shouldn't be afraid of ideas doesn't mean everything gets equal attention. And I think some of the panelists have made that point again and again. And that speaks to civility, that you can hear what someone's saying and give them the benefit of the doubt intellectually. It does not weaken your position. It doesn't weaken you as a person or your argument to listen and be open enough to hear what someone else is putting forward. And I think that that can strengthen one's position as well. So not being afraid of ideas, but recognizing that not all ideas are equal, and respecting the humanity of the other person doesn't diminish your points or your arguments. And I also very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this panel and this conversation. Thank you very much.
And I would just say, I really appreciate the format. One of the things that I love about working at a school is all the events that happen. And I've always told people that my favorite type of event is a panel discussion. And that is because you get different perspectives on a single topic. And so I think that, you know, again, this was a perfect format or a perfect topic to have this format. And I do appreciate all the different perspectives that were presented by everyone. And I appreciate, Nathania, you're inviting me to be part of it.
And adding on to Chuck, I would just like to say thank you guys so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. This is my first panel ever. And coincidentally, free speech is something that I such an advocate for, and I often have conversations with my family, friends, and just really pushing for us to be free thinkers and to look into the things that we see online, look into what we believe and question that and be willing to be wrong. And I think it's very important to have open spaces where we can share different ideas and recognize that maybe we might be wrong, or if we believe that we are right, we can go ahead and and if we believe that we are right, we can go ahead and share our ideas and be able to discuss in civility why we believe that what we believe is right.
Yeah, everything on this panel was just an amazing experience, just hearing everyone's thoughts and just being able to really engage in this discussion. And just my final thought really was that, like, we're often told like that there's a time and place for everything, that societal cues and norms, they tend to function as a sort of social control mechanism. And when it comes to like discussions like these, like everyone is just so open and there aren't any like societal cues like you shouldn't be saying that or you shouldn't be saying this, because that's just what this panel epitomized what it meant to have freedom of speech. And that's what I'd like to leave you with. And thank you so much for letting me be a part of this.
Well, this has been wonderful. My hope is that people will take what we've discussed today and take it forward and have their own discussions, and that the conversations will continue. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.